Well, I think I won't speak much about economics today because I don't know that much about economics. On the other hand, if the economists knew something about economics, we wouldn't be here either. But perhaps I talk a little bit about what's happened in the last several decades. I would argue that what we saw this year was the end of the post-Cold War era. We saw it with the shattering of what has been called the post-1991 settlement. The post-1991 settlement being more or less the quiet, tacit agreements we had about the way things were run in Europe, kind of an aversion of the cuius regio, eius religio of the Westphalian period, which was that, all right, all of those countries that came out of the Cold War that wanted to be in the European Union and then worked hard could become members of the European Union and NATO. And those that didn't could do what they wanted, and if they weren't very democratic or authoritarian, that was their problem. We weren't going to really get overly upset about it. We're not going to make too many efforts to change that. But that whatever the case may be, we are not going to have war. We want to have war. We will not have war of one country invading another. We did see and witness war in the 90s in both Serbia and in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Croatia, but that was largely an internal civil war, even though what emerged from that were independent countries. Nonetheless, the idea that you would go and invade some other country was just not was not within our purview of possibilities. That was changed on 08 with what happened in Georgia. And that is, that I think is one reason why, at least in large parts of Europe, people are quite concerned, because that is a completely and wholly new situation. We have based, I would say, the approach of the European Union since its inception really was to put in practice the ideas of the Kantian perpetual peace. Recall Immanuel Kant said that if you have rule of law, separation of powers, democracy, and a confederation, all issues can be resolved through discussions, negotiations, and if you don't have, and process, and if it doesn't work, then you always have consensus and or qualified, I mean in modern terms, qualified majority voting. However, and that's basically been the source of success for the European Union. The problem with the Kantian model is that it doesn't really work if you don't play by the rules, and in fact, we see that outside of the European Union, there are those who don't play by the rules, and here the operative model is no longer Immanuel Kant, but the Melian dialogues and Thucydides, in which, if you recall your Thucydides, the Athenians came to a small island of Melos and said, now submit to us. The Melians came up with all kinds of legal and moral arguments why they shouldn't, and then the Athenians tell the Melians that the strong do what they can and the weak do what they must. That's sort of foreign policy 101. And we saw that happen this year. And in this case, we see that, and I think many countries in Europe, especially the newer members of Europe, believe that unless we do have a forceful European Union, a forceful NATO, we will be back to a Thucydian or Melian world. And that is something which scares many people. So what do we do today if we don't play by the rules? What do you do if you see a jingoist, hubristic Russia that claims broadly and proudly that it is back and that it doesn't need to play by the rules? Well, I think the options here are various. We who like sort of peace and harmony would hope that the European Union, in fact, stand up as a union. That is not always the case because there are too many economic considerations for some people to be able to withstand. And I think that is the challenge that we face in the European Union and in the liberal democratic West, is how strong is our moral backbone when huge sums of money are floating around in a context of authoritarian capitalism and petrostates that have huge resources and don't need to follow rules of democracy, transparency. And that's a moral threat, I think, to many leaders in Europe, and that is one of the difficulties we have been facing here for a while, in that the principles of the European Union and the West in general of transparency, rule of law, and liberal democracy can be subverted when we see offerings of huge amounts of money, or deals, or special contracts for your country and no other. All of those things, I think, pull at and stretch the moral fiber of the European Union, and I think that's what we have to deal with. Where we are, to be less philosophical in terms of where we are heading with Europe, when I say that the post-91 settlement was shattered, I think perhaps we see it best in the case of NATO. Recall Manfred Wörner's original expression, which was then taken over by Richard Lugar about 12 years ago regarding NATO, out of area or out of business. Meaning that since all of the problems had been solved in Europe and everything was wonderful, that now if NATO is to survive and have a raison d'etre, it has to go outside, has to find other monsters to battle. In fact, I think today we are back, or rather, as opposed to what Manfred Wörner and Richard Lugar said, it's back in area or out of business. Because I think, once again, Europe has to think about its own security. It has to think of its own security in terms that we thought had ended with 9/11. We don't only talk about asymmetric threats, we are back to the era of symmetric threats. So I think that now that I've spoken for my 10 minutes, that those are the problems we are confronted. I would end on this note, and just to bring it back to France, is that I think ultimately we need to defend liberal democracy. That is really the task that especially all of us Melians have to rely on, because the small, and each of us is small, even Germany and France are small compared to China, that if we want to have a world organized along on law, then we have to stick together. I think this is why Edouard Balladur's recent proposal of about a year ago, that we should get the democracies of the world, liberal democracies of the world together, or bind them more tightly, makes a lot of sense, and I think that's a direction worth pursuing. But that's my 10 minutes. Thank you.